I wonder how many of all of you have savings locked away in the banking system where you think it's safe. Well, under Labour, it would be safer under your bed.
Good evening. When Malcolm Fraser called this election 4 weeks ago, it was seen by many observers as a massive gamble. Now, a week to polling day, there'd seem to be little to alter that view. Latest opinion polls place Labour ahead by a huge 13%. Now, a week in politics is, of course, a long time. The question the government must be asking itself tonight, though, is will it be long enough? Well, to take questions on his government's policies and performance and his own standing, we've been joined before an audience in the Sydney studio by the Prime Minister. And with me to question him are Geoffrey Barker of The Age and Peter Bowers of the Sydney Morning Herald. Prime Minister, when you sought this election from the Governor-General, you cited the obstruction of 13 bills in the Senate, 9 of which related to sales tax measures. Now, if, as you have said, you are not going to introduce those sales tax measures, why are we all here? Why are we having this election?
We're having an election because we really needed a double dissolution on account of the general workability of Parliament. The Australian Labor Party had said on more than one occasion that they would not obstruct budget bills, but then of course they did, and the Democrats did. And if you look at the history of double dissolutions, you'll find that the particular measure that has provided the trigger, is just that. It provides the technical trigger for the double dissolution. And to have a double dissolution, it's got to be before the end of this financial year, and May would therefore be the latest practicable date. And on that basis, the election is only a couple of months early.
On the question of the workability of the Parliament, though, how is it that Parliament suddenly became so unworkable on the very day when it was clear to everyone that Labour was going to examine its leadership? And why was it that it became unworkable when the government had found it workable for something like 12 months after those sales tax measures were rejected?
Oh, no. I think you need to look at the time spent in the Parliament, in the Senate in particular, of course, in the budget session. The Senate sat for an inordinately long period and some important legislation, and indeed one important piece of legislation concerning the ABC, couldn't even get through. And the amount of time that went for government business was very small.
Why was Parliament not unworkable then? Why was it unworkable when it wasn't even sitting?
Weren't you aware I was on my back then?
But Prime Minister, haven't you, in a sense, made the Governor-General look silly by instancing these bills as important legislation which have been rejected by the Senate, securing the double dissolution on the strength of it, and now seeming to have abandoned those bills?
Not at all, because there were other bills, and you only need one bill to provide the trigger, only one that meets the requirement. But look, there really are great issues before the people of Australia on this particular occasion. There are some philosophical differences between the parties. There are some economic differences of a massive kind. I really do hope, with all the goodwill in the world, that we're going to have an opportunity to examine those policy differences, because I think they're of massive importance.
Well, can you be precise about the policy position you're going to take on those sales tax measures if you are returned to government?
I have been.
You have said variously that if they were introduced, there would be offsetting provisions in personal tax. You then said bluntly they would not be introduced on essential services. Mr. Anthony said in Mackay on Wednesday that any such new taxes would be considered in a budget context. Now Sir James Killen says it would be an absurdity to say sales tax is going to be abolished, that they would not be reintroduced in that precise form but could be proposed at a different rate. Precisely what is going to happen to them?
There will not be new measures introduced on essential items. I said that quite categorically. And that's the position.
Does that mean that on the items that are rejected by the Senate, they will not be reintroduced?
Yes.
Can we talk about the deficit? Because the deficit's important, although I notice you managed to deliver your policy speech without once referring to it. Mr. Fraser, why is it responsible for you to have an unplanned deficit of $2.5 billion, and it's totally irresponsible for the Labor Party to have a planned deficit of $2.5 billion?
First of all, your figures are wrong. But let me explain again what's happened. Because the world recession
has... You won't answer the question,
Yes,
will you?
I will answer the question, Peter, and I'll answer it very precisely. But I'll answer it also, if I may, in my own way. Is that okay? The deficit has run out this year because the world recession has bit much harder on the Australian economy than anyone had envisaged, because the drought is infinitely worse than anyone had thought. The spring rains failed completely through New South Wales and Victoria, and you've only got to travel through any part of either state, with very, very minor exceptions, to know the impact of that. Right through the city of Melbourne, for example, all the parks are dug up with holes in close to the trees, hoping they can keep them alive, just to maximise the use of what very little water is available. So it's not only country people and country towns that know the impact of that. People in the cities also know it, especially when the dust clouds out the city. And on top of that, the wages explosion over the last couple of years has done a great deal to damage Australian enterprise, make it impossible to sell Australian goods. So the revenue get from Australian companies, the revenue get from people being employed falls. And so the deficit runs out. Now, that's why it's happened, and people need to understand why it's happened. And nothing can alter that. The deficit is going to be that $4 billion through this year. The point I'm seeking to make is that the Australian Labor Party plan to spend in their first year, and they've not challenged the figure, an extra $4 billion on top of whatever the position is now. And spending that extra $4 billion on top of it, it's fair enough to ask where they're going to get it from. Now, they've committed themselves to some small income tax cuts. The Socialist Manifesto, or Prices and Incomes Accord, whatever you want to call it, also commits them to indirect tax cuts whenever they can, certainly not to indirect tax increases. Therefore, they're not going to fund any part of that deficit from direct or indirect taxation. That means they've got to go to the banking system, to the financial markets. They're going to have to take $4 billion more out of the financial system. How are they going to do that? There are a number of ways, but the most orthodox way is to offer special bonds at a much higher rate of interest. It is fair enough. Now, you asked me to answer the question, why is it all right for us to have an unplanned one and for them to have a planned one? I've given the reasons why the unplanned deficit blew out, and we wish it hadn't, but nothing could have avoided it, unless you're going to say that Malcolm Fraser is responsible for the drought, and I suppose before the next Saturday I will be, in somebody's book.
No, I think God's responsible for the drought, but surely you're responsible. You're the Prime Minister. You've been in government for 7 years. It's your budget. And don't you accept... I mean, you and Mr Howard, quite brilliantly, if I might say so, take a completely detached view, an observer's view, as if you're no more responsible for the recession, no more responsible for your budget, no more responsible for the deficit than you are for the drought. Now, don't you accept any responsibility whatsoever for the state of the Australian economy? And what are you going to do about it?
Well, since you mentioned 7 years, let me just say, before the three things I mentioned, the world recession, and, do you want to say we're responsible for British, French,
now we're going
American...
back to the wicked Whitlam government, are we?
Well, am I allowed to answer your question, or
yes?
Do you not want...
I've heard it all before, but please go ahead.
The world recession has gone on much longer than anyone anticipated, and obviously has an impact on Australia. It's a question of the policies we put in place to deal with that situation, whether the policies we put in place assist or make it worse. I had said, talking about home building, but you could talk about other policies we put in place through the last budget to help families, which are designed very much to assist and help Australians through a difficult period. But then again, it's how you respond to the drought. It's how you respond to a wages explosion, which is promoted not by government policy, but by ACTU policy laid down in 1979, coupled with shorter hours. And our response has been very clear and very plain. The wages pause is a very essential part of it.
Where was that wages freeze when many people would argue it was most needed after the collapse of wage indexation in 1981?
Well, I think it would be helpful if I very briefly indicated why wage indexation collapsed, and then I'll come to the wages freeze. Wage indexation was a very rigid system, And the Arbitration Commission, in the end, finished it because there was so much pressure in the union movement, transport workers and many others, for adjustments. And industrial disputation was growing greatly, and the Commission itself came to the judgment that they could not hold wage indexation. And in that environment, I don't believe for 1 minute you would have got the agreement of all governments to the wages pause. We introduced a budget last year which assisted a number of Australian families by, say, $17 or $18 a week when you take all the budget measures into account. And that obviously helped to establish the circumstances in which wage restraint was a reasonable thing to ask for. But because the figures were coming through of very high wage increases through the year, confirmed by figures published within the last couple of days in the year to December of 17%, it became clear that something more was needed if Australian industry was to become competitive again.
But isn't it...
And then, no, but look, this gets right down to the wages pause. It's at that point that the need for the wage pause becomes evident. And I was out of action, as you may or may not remember, and Doug Anthony and John Howard, with great skill and patience, and in difficult circumstances, negotiated a wage pause with all state governments, including 3 Labour governments.
4 now.
Yes, but they weren't when they were negotiated.
I know.
They actually negotiated with 3 Labour governments. And the point is that they agreed. And they knew that was an election, was in the offing at some point. And to get that agreement at that time, I think, was a remarkable achievement.
What are you going to do when it expires? Now in 4 months in the Labour states and in 10 months with respect to the Commonwealth. What happens then? We're
all committed to a review in May or June. Obviously, if you go out and ask the Labour states now, you're not, it's an election, you're not going to get agreement. But if we were able to get agreement in December with an election in the offing, I would believe we would get agreement in May or June with an election passed for an extension. In addition to that, there's our proposal for a referendum, which I'm also sure would be passed, and other proposals in relation to industrial relations. We would want, as we approach the end of the year, to have a situation where governments would be putting common views to the industrial tribunals or to the Arbitration Commission, a commission which by that time would be greatly strengthened because of the referendum.
Will you give a cast-iron assurance that that policy will work?
Well, there are some policies you can give a cast-iron commitment that they will work. I believe that that policy will work because we've already negotiated the first step in very, very difficult circumstances. And the later steps, I think, would be easier to negotiate. And there are some things in the life of government or a nation, or for that matter a family, which need to be taken step by step. I could make a very simple and rather a messy analogy, if you wanted to. If you've got somebody trying to eat a rather large cream cake, and they try and eat it all with one mouthful, they're going to have the cream cake all over their face. But if they take it step by step or bite by bite, they can accomplish the task in a sensible and reasonable and tidy manner.
I take it away, but I've stopped eating cream cakes.
Prime Minister,
I'm sorry, that enjoyment has passed out of your life. But this is one of those areas, because of the sensitivities, governments need to take it step by step.
Well, Prime Minister, there are some 700,000 people in this country now who can't afford cream cakes. And in 1975, you did say quite categorically that your government would provide jobs for all who wanted to work. Now, unemployment would seem to be probably the most pressing issue in this election. When will we be able to expect you to do something to bring this terrible level of unemployment down?
First, since you went back to 1975, I'd like to indicate what happened in the initial years after that. 455,000 new jobs were created in Australia as a result of our policies. And then again, and I regret having to come back to it, but you ask questions which are relevant to it. The recession hit, the drought hit, that wages explosion hit. And those 3 things devastated jobs in this country. With the wage pause staying in place, with our policies staying in place of moderation, then private enterprise will start again to be profitable. And they're the great employers. Governments can only put a limited number of extra people on a government payroll. Taxpayers have to pay for that anyway, and taxpayers paying for it tends to inhibit private employment. So you can't put a timing and a figure on what will happen, but you can know the policies that are going to eat into that number unemployed, and you can also know quite clearly the policies that will make that number worse. What the Labour Party are now proposing are policies that have been tried in Britain and failed, tried in France and rejected, and tried in other countries of Europe and failed. The only difference here is that the attempt to introduce those sorts of policies, prices and incomes policies, or the Socialist Manifesto, goes so much further than ever occurred in Britain or France, and we could expect, therefore, that the result would be so much worse in terms of increased unemployment.
But, Prime Minister, we've had your policies in place for 7 years now, and there might have been 450,000 new jobs created, but there are still 700,000 people out of work. Now you tell us, you claim to be able to know that your policies will work and cut back unemployment, yet you castigated Mr Keating very heavily the other day because he says he wasn't sure that the prices and incomes policy will work. How can you expect people now to believe you know your policies will work to cut down unemployment eventually, when in fact it is trebled in your period of office?
But you're very conveniently forgetting that the position was getting better until three things happened. And you can't ignore the fact that that world recession has gone on for years. Our policies kept the recession out of Australia for a long time after it had devastated Britain and America and much of Europe. But then that and the drought and that wages explosion, which itself is responsible for tens upon tens of thousands of additional jobs being lost. And you can't ignore those facts. They are part of the very recent history of Australia.
Mr Fraser, you're appearing in this programme to be the cool and patient explainer. In the past week of the campaign, your politics have been categorised as the politics of fear, with phrases like the savings of the dead. The Murdoch flagship, for example, described your comments about people's savings in banks as despicable and irresponsible. How is it that a Prime Minister who supposedly prefers respect to popularity and aspires to statesmanship of a kind is openly embarking on a campaign of this kind?
It's, well, the savings of the dead, death duties. I'm very glad they gave a commitment not to introduce death duties, but Mr Keynes' government sought to, and was only run off the track when people indicated very plainly that that would be very bad for the Victorian economy. And to have a commitment out of the Labour Party that that will not happen is obviously very useful through this campaign. But death duties, or the savings of the dead, what difference is it? It's the same expression.
Do you regret your comments about savings banks?
No, but, well, let me make the point. It wasn't about savings banks, it was about savings. It was about savings.
Yes. Do you regret your comment?
Let me answer that point. I had on a number of occasions used Mr Keating's quotation in which he said something to the effect, we have very large savings locked up in the banking system with which we could use to fund that sort of deficit. Savings locked up in the banking system. And I'd been trying to get some publicity for that particular sentence and found that using cool, calm and collected language was failing utterly to get any publicity for it. So something was needed that was going to jolt things into, to attention.
And cause distress among the banking community as well?
Oh, not at all. The bankers did not ask me to retract one word of what I'd said. But I think you ought also to know that in the Labour Party platform, on page 46, if you want to know, there is a sentence which goes something like this. The words won't be exact, but the sense will be precise, and precisely the same as in the document. The Labour Party wants to be able to control a sufficient part of the country's saving to fund its priority programs. The Labour Party wants to be able to control, or will ensure that it can control, a sufficient part of the country's savings to fund its priority programs. Now, note the word control note the words, the country's savings. Let me ask what the words country's savings are. That's not an amorphous mass.
Have you noted Mr. Hawke's statement that he's not proposing to use existing legislation or new legislation to direct those savings?
But I'm going to the platform. The platform binds the Labour Party.
So
the left wing can, they can direct people to do what the platform says. And it's on page 46.
So
no, but please, I just haven't finished on one point.
All right.
I wanted to make the point that the words, the country's savings, that's not something amorphous. The country's savings are nothing more than the accumulation of the savings of every individual Australian. And that needs to be understood. And these are the words of the platform.
So, Prime Minister, if the unthinkable were to happen and the Labor Party was to win next Saturday, you would then, therefore, advise people to go to the bank, take out their money and stick it under the bed.
You're being now far too literal.
But that's what you said.
Would
you like us to read
They're your words, not mine, Prime Minister.
I know what I said.
You said your savings would be safer under the bed than in the banks under Labor. You told that to a Melbourne rally to thousands of people. We just saw it again tonight. Do you resile from that?
No, I don't. But I'm saying you're taking the words. Look, you've made a point. If you want to say anything more, Peter, before I respond to it, you say it now, and then I'll respond.
Well, thank you very much. Because you said it a minute. Thank you very much, Prime Minister. You said a minute ago that your statement caused no concern among the banking community. Well, this is what the Secretary of the Commonwealth Banking Corporation, Mr. Adrian Walker, had to say. He said calls had been received from all over Australia, and he went on, quote, I couldn't tell you the number, but we have had a number of calls because people are naturally concerned when the number one citizen, the Prime Minister, makes a statement of that sort. Now, here is a very senior bank executive saying, you made statements that worried bank customers all over Australia. Now, aren't Australians, Prime Minister, entitled to expect better behaviour from the number one citizen?
Let me say again that nobody from the banking community asked me to withdraw what I'd said. Somebody from the Bankers Association rang me late that one particular night and indicated that he'd been very much misreported by the press in relation to it. But that's by the way, and it's not the main part of the question. It was very necessary to get publicity for the way in which the Labour Party would fund its programs. I could have gone on up to election day and long past election day using cold economists' language, and it was plain that nobody was going to print it. And it was very important that people centre their attention not only on Mr. Keating's words, but more particularly on those words in that platform document. Control of the country's savings sufficient to fund the Labour Party's priority programs. Now, what does control the country's savings mean? And let me repeat, the country's savings are only the accumulation of the savings of individual Australians. And if the Labour Party wants to control those savings, that's their word, not mine. Now, I suggest that none of you believed that Mr. Hawke was going to ride up to a bank on the 6th of March on his Charger, 6 guns in his hand, and say, give me your savings. Now, really, nobody believed that that was going to happen. But if Labour's programs were put in place, if they come to get that extra $4 billion, to spend that extra $4 billion, then the value of savings will be eroded, inflation will be rampant, interest rates will go very high, and the savings of tens upon tens of thousands of Australians are going to be diminished day by day, week by week.
How are you going to fund your proposed new deficit problems? You're going to have oil reductions, you're going to have lost revenue there. What are your plans? Are we going to have a rough budget this year?
The point is that Labour's proposals are $4 billion on top of whatever is there now. And that's the point that needs to be got across. We don't say the present deficit is a peasant situation. It's not. But Labour's proposals are a starting price $4 billion on top. So $4 billion worse. $4 billion more for a government and $4 billion less for families, for individuals, for businesses, large or small. And you're going to have the government in competition with average Australians, little Australians, for the funds. And who's going to win in that
little
contest?
Australians, you've been terrifying.
Prime Minister, we're close to time.
Let me just pick up that comment.
Very quickly.
Because if Labour's policies are applied, I can promise you, Peter, that I am terrified for the future of this country.
Prime Minister, I wonder if we could just come back very briefly to your own deficit that we were speaking about a couple of minutes ago. Now, you say you are, I think you said you were terrified for Australians if...
Oh, but not only for that reason.
No. I want to talk about your deficit. If you were re-elected...
yes, but I wanted to explain why I was frightened for the future.
All right, but let me put this to you. If you are re-elected and you end up with a deficit of $4 billion or whatever, what will you do in your next budget to get it back? Will you, in fact, increase taxes or cut spending? How will you reduce the deficit if you are re-elected?
Or will you let her rip?
Or will you just let it go? Yes. I mean, that's the other part.
Our deficit was being funded this year with falling interest rates in a very responsible manner. And a large part of the funding process for this particular year, has already been completed with the various tenders that have gone on. And that's a process that's normal, responsible, and the deficit was being funded in a way which was still accommodating falls in interest rates. Now, I haven't seen the figures in relation to next year, but your question is highly relevant, because whatever the difficulties there would be in funding our deficit, and I'm not saying there couldn't be some difficulties, whatever those difficulties would be, the difficulties would be $4 billion worse under the Australian Labor Party. And that's the point that people need to understand. $4 billion is very hard for average families to relate to. But when you've got a government going in that would have to get that extra $4 billion, what chance does somebody get, you're going to have to get a home loan? What chance would somebody have to get a loan to expand their business or to put up a new shop front? It just wouldn't be on. The government would be taking it all. And get back to those terms. The Labor Party wants to be able to control sufficient of the country's savings to fund its own programs. Now that's telling us, that's warning us in the plainest possible terms, and you couple those policies together with the blueprint for socialist intervention and control, and you'd find the private enterprise system on which our living standards have been built being snuffed out. And that really does give us cause to be very fearful for the future of this country and the future of Australia's children.
Well, I guess we must all scamper off and find page 46 now. Prime Minister, I suppose tonight, congratulations also in order, in as much as you became last night the second longest serving Prime Minister of Australia.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
I suppose it's beyond contemplation, but how do you rate your chances of still being Prime Minister after next Saturday?
It'll be to the judgment of the Australian people. But I do not believe, I mean, many Australians are gamblers on the race course and I suppose with the poker machines. The Labor Party would be the biggest gamble in history with their children, with their families. I don't think Australians are going to take that gamble.
You wouldn't look like a little bet on it, would you?
Doggy to the end.
Well, here's one gambler.
Well, that must conclude our discussion with the Prime Minister. Thank you, Mr. Fraser, for appearing on Four Corners. Thank you, Peter Bowers, and thank you, Geoffrey Barker. Before we go, here's Peter Ross with a look at an important series of programmes starting on Four Corners next week.
While Australians vote on the issues of inflation, recession and unemployment, a different subject now dominates the political scene right across the Northern Hemisphere: the fear of nuclear war. Next week, Four Corners starts a major three-part series, The Mushroom Cloud. In part one, The Greening of Europe, I'll be reporting on a grassroots political uprising. In Germany, where they go to the polls the same weekend as we do, the Greens Party has become a major political force.
The biggest priority is to avoid an atomic or ecological catastrophe and to demilitarize society.
I wish it is surrounded by nuclear headquarters.
And in Britain, where an election is expected in June, more than 60% of the population say they don't want the American cruise missile.
This is the biggest issue that I remember around for 30, 40 years. There'll be thousands who'll be willing to go to prison. This will divide this country right down the center. It will be the dominating issue of any election.
1, 0.
In part two, God and the Bomb, Jeff McMullen describes how the nuclear freeze movement has divided the churches of America.
I'm with that crowd that says I'd rather be dead than red, and I'm proud of that.
It's not a question of whether it's better to be red or to be dead. It's a statement, it's better to do anything than to commit sin.
Here we go!
And in part three, with friends like these, Jim Downs examines the ANZUS alliance. Does our treaty with America really bring enough benefits to outweigh the risk of nuclear attack?
I don't think there's any question but that Northwest Cape, Pine Gap and Narungga would be at the very top of the Soviet strategic nuclear target lists. The three of them would all be hit virtually at the outset of any strategic nuclear exchange.
That's The Mushroom Cloud, 3 important Four Corners programs starting next Saturday at 7:30.
Well, to end, my personal thanks to a large number of concerned citizens, many of whom may have been watching tonight to see whether I had faded away entirely. Be assured I'm fitter than I've been for 2 decades. All I did was lose some weight, and since I don't propose to put it back, you'll just have to get used to the reality of a new, gaunt image. Good night.